Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Dan Lee, and here at Dan Lee Boatbuilding we're currently restoring this boat, which is a Healey 75. This boat has had quite a difficult life. It's been sunk for a long period of time. It was dropped on a concrete floor from quite a height, which did significant damage to the hull and structure. It was then repaired as an insurance job, which then resulted in all of that internal structure rotting out and completely failing. So in the previous couple of videos, we've been removing all of the work and internal structure that was done before, and we've been straightening out the hull and reinforcing it with some new biaxial glass on the inside. In this video, we're starting to make some of the internal components that are going to rebuild the structure of this boat. So the first thing to do was to remove the structure that we put on the bottom of the boat to pull it back into shape. Now that we've got the glass on the inside of the hull, that is enough to hold things in place so we can remove that structure. And then we can begin reinstating what was in the bottom of the boat. So that was the longitudinal floor stringers that we cut out of the boat before, and we made them by ripping some 22mm dowels straight down the middle, which you can see Will doing here. And because they weren't quite long enough to do the full run of the boat in one go, we needed to scarf those and make them up into longer pieces. So the way that we do scarfs on solid timber like this is we tend to just tip back our belt sander and set that with a bevel gauge if it needs to be to a certain bevel, or just by eye if not, and then we'll run the timber into that sanding face, and what it does is just puts a nice fine even taper, and we can do a lot of pieces of timber really quite quickly just by sighting the tip of that piece of timber to see that the scarf is square in reference to the piece of wood. So we scarfed all those up, and then we made up the little forward pieces as well that just return in towards the keel. Then once we had the blanks rough cut and dry fit for those, we started to make up some pattern frames. So we need to reinstate all the frames that were inside this boat. And these patterns were going to have a couple of functions really. They were going to help us to hold these floor stringers down in place whilst they were glued. And they were also going to become our patterns later on when we make the proper solid wood frames for this boat. So we just ripped some strips of scrap plywood down and put them into shape, just stuck them together with a glue gun. And then we took all the wood stringers back out and just profiled them so that they were a perfect match to the bottom of the hull. This was also a good opportunity to check that both sides of the hull were now in the same shape. So there's a full set of pattern frames in place. Then we were in a position to be able to start gluing in these floor stringers. So we glued them in with West System epoxy, thickened with colloidal silica. And because we used our peel ply on the glass on the inside of the boat, we've got a nice surface that we could bond to there without any need for keying up. Then we put those pattern frames back in over the top of those stringers, and as you can see, with a collection of many different clamps and arrangements, we pushed the whole assembly down into the bottom of the boat to make sure it was nicely pressed into place. So we use those pattern frames, and then we also use some quite rigid oak battens in between each of those frames, just because we found that they flexed nicely into the shape of the bottom of the hull and just applied a nice even pressure on all of those floor stringers at the same time. It's really just a case of kind of adding a clamp everywhere that one was needed, and we all know you can never have too many clamps. So once that was all done, we could take all of that structure back out, and the floor stringers are now nicely glued in place. And we could begin to glass over the top of those. So these get the same biaxial cloth that we used on the bottom of the hull over the top of the stringers, but this was in a tape form, so it's a nice tape that would just fit over each stringer individually. And we filleted the inner corners of those stringers as well, just to help us with laying the glass over that shape. That was then peel plied so that we can continue again in the future with bonding over the top of that when we come to the framework. Then we are on to making the gripe. Well, that is what I'm calling this piece of timber anyway. This is that little half moon shaped piece of timber that we took out of the forward end of the boat, and it sort of runs up from the keel position to the stem. It's roughly what would be called the gripe in something like a Chris Craft. And this was a little piece of timber that was glassed over. If you remember from the previous video, it was very rotten and in poor condition when we took the old one out. So I drew around the existing one for that and then started to make a new one. So here's a little technique that I use quite often with making things like this, just for scribing parallel lines, lines to an edge. So you can see I'm drawing a center line here, and I've just measured out one section of it, and then I've used my fingers as a guide to draw that line parallel all the way down the middle. So I place the tip of the pencil, I touch my fingers up against the side of the timber, and then I squeeze the pencil with those timbers, and I use that as a guide to run the pencil all the way down the timber. So I've done the center one here, and then you can see I've done the slightly offset one, because we're going to have a flat on the middle of this piece of wood. So I do one side, and then I keep my fingers attached to the pencil in that position. I turn the timber around, then I do the other side, and you end up with this parallel line marked down the middle. You can see I also do a similar thing on the side of the timber here, and using that outer curve just to form an offset inner curve. So the idea is that the outer edges of this piece of timber are both going to be beveled down to these lines. So then I start to do that on the sanding machine, and what I'm doing here is I'm basically just checking back against those lines constantly to see how much material I'm taking off in either one direction. If I'm taking off a bit more material towards one of the lines than the other, then I adjust the angle at which I'm putting the part into the sanding machine. And you can see that those lines will indicate how much more material you've got to go in all the various places, so you can just slowly work down to that pencil line. It's something that I do quite a lot, actually, working down to a pencil line, but you've got to remember that as soon as that pencil line disappears, you lose all reference of what you're taking off and where. So as soon as the pencil line goes, you either draw a new pencil line so you've got a new reference, or leave the material removal in that area. So you can see there a comparison of the two parts together. After that, we were on to making the transom bow. So this is the curved timber that runs along the bottom of the transom and forms the support right down aft in that section of the boat. So this originally was a curved cut piece of mahogany that was rotten and we had to remove. So what we're going to do is replace that with a piece of laminated mahogany. We're making this up out of 5 pieces of 6mm Sapele, and we started off by just springing that into place to get the right width that was going to follow that curve, and then we scribed it to follow the shape of the bottom of the boat. After we got that right, then we proceeded with cutting 5 patterns off of that one so that we had 5 layers that were all the same. Then a quick check just to make sure that all 5 layers were going to fit into the area and spring into place nicely. We always like to do a dry fit of things as many times as possible to check it's going to work properly. Then it's held in place with this spreader clamp. So these Irwin clamps are really good because you can reverse one of the heads on them and turn it into a clamp that actually pushes things apart rather than squeezes it together. So what we did in order to squash this lamination into position was to just screw a block in place on the bottom of the boat, and this was using the holes that are already in the hull for the prop shaft strut, and that spreader clamp could then go up against that and push all the laminations in nice and tightly against the back of the transom. So once I was happy that that was going to work as a dry fit scenario, it was time to start gluing up. So for general kind of bonding applications like this, we tend to use West System epoxy and thicken that with colloidal silica. Anything that's not going to be a bright varnished finish or is going to be painted over, we'll use colloidal for that. It's a good general purpose thickening agent. So we mix that up to roughly a sort of thick mayonnaise texture. So I'm using the fine-toothed edge of the West System notch spreader to put this on. And I'm quite meticulous when doing parts like this to make sure that every part of both of the mating faces of these laminations are covered. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, we want to make sure that there's plenty of glue within that joint and there's not going to be any dry spots. But secondly, when you consider that epoxy has such great water resistant properties, by ensuring that all of these faces are completely covered, it means that you actually have a waterproof barrier throughout this part in between each lamination. So we've got 5 pieces of timber here with 4 glue lines in between them. So you've got a complete epoxy barrier between each one of those pieces of timber. That means that if you get water ingress into one of those parts, it's not going to continue to spread through all of them. So you're going to severely limit the rate at which rot could potentially travel through that timber should it ever get into place there, which is quite unlikely anyway. So once that's glued up, I then wrap it in the plastic which I'm using to cover my bench. And this is just polythene bags. They're really good for epoxy work like this. So it gets rolled up into a neat little parcel. All the edges get taped off and enclosed, and it also means that you've got a really nice clean part that you can handle within the boat. So you're not getting epoxy all over the place. You can see that I've even taken my gloves off here because it's nice and clean to work with. So that gets put back into the boat, and you can see it's a little bit tight on the outer edges because we've got polythene wrapped over the ends now. Then we're using that spreader clamp again just to spring the center of that lamination nice and tight against the transom. And a couple of extra clamps are added just to make sure we've got a good squeeze down there and compression on the glue joint. 2 clamps either side, also just push that down into the bottom of the transom. So we've got a really nice form there which is going to fit nice and tightly when it comes to gluing this part back in. And then the following day, once the epoxy is fully cured, we can take the part back out. And then it's just a case of unwrapping the polythene, which just peels really nice and easily off the epoxy because it doesn't bond to it at all. And then it's cleaned up on the surface planer for the edge that's got to be straight, which is the top edge of the bow. So with laminations like this, I always go slightly wider with the stock to account for the fact that these need to be cleaned up afterwards, because they will always get some sort of slippage between the layers of laminations. So just make sure that you account for that if you're doing something similar and you start with a part that's too wide. The top curved edge is then shaped on the sander and cleaned up, and you can see the laminations and the glue lines that we've got in the finished part there. Really strong component that is also going to be highly resistant to rot travelling through it if that instance should ever arise, which is really quite unlikely now. Then I'm just putting a small bevel on the bottom edge, which is going to help it to sit into the transom nice and neatly and just allow for the fillet which is created by the glass where that runs up inside the boat. Small bit of shaping by hand with a block plane, and it is ready to go back in. Then it's over to Will, and he was making some of the other components that come off of this. So you've got the keel pad that runs along the bottom side of the transom bow and just tucks into it. That supports the prop shaft strut and the rudder. and then this vertical beam as well, which comes up the back of the transom, and that takes the lifting eye which comes up through the aft deck. So we wanted to notch those into this transom bow, so we've got a really nice strong joint between all three of those parts. We want them all tied in together really nicely, so we were just cutting some little tenons to notch those parts all together. And there you can see the final installation of all three parts and how they go together. That's the collection of all the new replacement parts and their old originals that we took out of the boat. We're slowly building a catalogue of bits ready to go back in. After that, we were on to removing the steering assembly. So a lot of the parts on the Healey boats came from the Healey cars, and I believe that this steering mechanism comes from an Austin A30. Yeah, see that sits down on that cup. Yeah. So this is the steering box that is positioned up forward in the boat, as you can see there. It's quite a critical component for the position of everything else, because this steering box runs down from the dash to a floor mounted beam, which you can see here. This carries all of the steering and the direct linkages for the throttle and gears as well. So it's really quite a critical part to be positioned within the boat. So the plan is that as we rebuild, we're going to start with this and we're going to work all the framework back from it. So the first thing we needed to do was to try and get all of this assembly out of the old timber work so that we could pattern these timbers for new ones. That's going to be one of the first jobs that we do in the next video. But we had the challenge of getting this little aluminium moulding out, which carries all the shafts for the throttle and for the gears. So first of all, we tried heating the shaft. That will quite often burn away some of the glue or oil or residue that is in the surrounding timber. In this instance that didn't work, so we then tried core drilling over the outside of the shaft to relieve some of the timber that is tightly packed around the outside of that. That also didn't work, we couldn't get it to budge. We then decided to remove this end of the stringer, which you can see is taken off here. Once that stringer was removed, we only had half of that aluminium casting still set in wood, but it was still pretty firmly lodged in there. It didn't want to budge, even with a big lump hammer. So we couldn't even get that to twist actually. So finally what we did was cut a relief cut through the bottom of this big mountain timber, just to give a bit of extra relief on that joint, and we finally got it to move and come out. So that's as far as we're going with the Healey Restoration Part 3. In video number 4, we're going to be starting to do some more of the wooden parts of the boat and patterning all of those. So we're going to start with those steering blocks that we just took all of the mechanism out of. We're going to pattern those, and we're going to start to be making the first couple of frames of the boat. So we're going to start with that steering assembly and work back from there, putting in all new mahogany frames as we go. We're also going to be making the two main stringers that run down the center line of the boat, and those are going to be laminated from mahogany as well. So that's about the sum of what we've done so far on the boat. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you're not already subscribed, please remember to subscribe to the channel and you can stay up to date with everything else that we're doing. We're going to be posting the next video probably in a couple of weeks time when we've got all the framework done on the boat, so make sure you keep your eyes peeled for that one, and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers guys.